Hide that pathetic little job of yours tonight, Renata. My father's voice was ice wrapped in silk, his fingers tugging at his gold cufflinks as he looked me over like something he'd scraped off his shoe. Your sister is bringing home a decorated Navy commander tonight. A man like that has no patience for ordinary, forgettable people. If you humiliate this family in front of him, you are finished. Do you understand me? Across the marble foyer, my sister Delphine let out a bright, tinkling laugh, spinning once beneath the crystal chandelier so her champagne-colored gown caught the light. She looked at me the way you'd look at a maid who had wandered into the wrong wing of the house. None of them had the faintest idea what I actually did for a living. The plain navy blazer I wore that night, buttoned to the throat, hid a career none of them had ever bothered to ask about, let alone understand. Then the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the entire room seemed to inhale at once. Commander Elias Thorne stepped through, his dress uniform heavy with ribbons, his bearing unmistakably that of a man who had led people through hell and back. He didn't glance at my father. He didn't glance at Delphine, though her hand was already reaching for his arm. His eyes swept the room once, landed on me, and stopped. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the floor. He came to rigid attention, and in a voice gone hoarse with disbelief, he whispered, "My God, it's the Whiteout pilot. My name is Renata Voss. For 12 years, my life has not belonged to country clubs, seating charts, or the opinions of people who measure worth in thread counts. It has belonged to the United States Army. I earned the rank of lieutenant colonel, not through my father's connections, not through a family name that opened doors, but through years of exhaustion, injury, fear, and the kind of discipline that reshapes a person from the inside out. I led classified rotary wing operations in places that never appear on the evening news, places most people will never learn existed. Because of the security classifications surrounding my missions, I never spoke about my work at home. When my father asked, and he rarely did, I told him I handled logistics coordination for a federal agency. To Richard Voss, that phrase might as well have meant filing cabinets and fluorescent lighting. It was, to him, the most forgettable sentence a daughter could produce. My father cared about exactly one thing, how things looked. And in his eyes, my younger sister Delphine was the family's masterpiece. A woman who had turned socializing into a full-time occupation, who spent his money as though it replenished itself, who had perfected the art of appearing effortlessly enviable. Tonight was supposed to be the crown jewel of her campaign. She had spent the last 4 months dating Commander Elias Thorne, a man whose reputation inside special operations circles bordered on mythology. My father had rented the entire east wing of the Alderidge Country Club to throw a celebration in the commander's honor, convinced that this one relationship could finally buy our family a permanent seat among the city's elite. I had been invited only because excluding me outright would have raised questions he didn't want asked. The moment I walked through the doors in my plain charcoal blazer, my father pulled me into an alcove behind a marble column, his voice a low, furious hiss. "Look at yourself," he said, eyes raking over the blazer, the flat shoes, the absence of anything that sparkled. "You look like you answer phones for a living. If Commander Thorne so much as glances at you, he'll think this entire family has no breeding whatsoever." Delphine drifted over just in time to add her own contribution, adjusting a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Don't be too hard on her, Daddy. Some people just aren't built for elegant things." She turned to me with a saccharine smile. "Renata's used to break rooms and vending machine coffee. I'm sure she thinks tonight's dinner is a big deal because there's more than one fork." They laughed together, that easy, cruel laugh of people who have never once had to justify their own existence. My father did not seat me at the head table beneath the floral centerpieces and the imported crystal. Instead, he steered me to a small round table wedged behind a column and an oversized potted palm, close enough to the kitchen doors that I could hear the clatter of the wait staff on the other side. Before he walked away, he leaned down, his breath warm with expensive scotch. "Here are the rules for tonight. You stay at this table. You do not approach the commander. You do not speak unless spoken to. If a waiter needs a hand, you may clear a few plates. It will at least make you useful for once. If anyone asks who you are, tell them you're a cousin who helps with the family's paperwork. Do not embarrass this family with the truth of your little life." I picked up my water glass and said nothing. 12 years earlier, I had learned to sit perfectly still while artillery rounds walked closer to my position. My father's threats, delivered in a ballroom that smelled of orchids and old money, didn't even register as danger. If anything, they only illuminated how small his entire world truly was, a world built from seating charts and cufflinks, guarded by a man who had never once had to keep another human being alive. I watched him and Delphine cross the room toward the entrance, practically floating on the anticipation of the evening ahead, and I sipped my water and waited. The truth was, my relationship with this family had been quietly dying for over a decade, one dismissed phone call at a time. I remembered the day I told my father I'd been accepted into flight school, how his first question wasn't about the training or the danger, but whether it would interfere with Delphine's debutante ball 6 months later. I remembered graduating from Ranger School with a stress fracture in my tibia and a body that had forgotten what uninterrupted sleep felt like, and calling home to hear my mother, before she passed, ask politely whether I'd found a nice young man yet at that army thing. Nobody in this family had ever asked to see a single photograph from deployment. Nobody had asked what a call sign was or why mine had become, among the small circle of people who knew it, something close to a legend. I hadn't chosen the name Whiteout. It had chosen me, on a night in the mountains that I still, 12 years later, sometimes felt in my hands before I fell asleep. That night was 5 years ago. A joint reconnaissance element, 8 operators strong, had been compromised on a frozen ridgeline in terrain so remote that even satellite coverage came and went like a bad radio signal. A whiteout blizzard had rolled in without warning, visibility measured in feet, winds gusting past 70 miles an hour, temperatures that turned rifle oil to sludge. Enemy fire pinned the team against an exposed rock face. Their radio operator took a round through the shoulder. Every conventional airframe scheduled for extraction refused the mission outright. Command had begun drafting the paperwork to write the team off as a loss. I had been sitting alert duty in a modified Black Hawk 2 ridgelines away, a bird stripped down and reinforced for exactly the kind of flying nobody sane wanted to attempt. When the call came through, 8 men, no extraction, conditions rated impossible, I didn't wait for a formal order. I took the stick myself. I flew that aircraft below the radar coverage, threading between rock faces I could see only in flashes when the wind briefly thinned the snow, close enough to stone that my crew chief later told me he could have reached out and touched the cliff face from the open door. Rounds tore through the tail boom twice. I held that Black Hawk in a hover 18 inches off a ledge, no wider than a hallway, while 8 wounded, freezing men were pulled aboard one at a time, and then I flew all of us back out through the same blind fury of snow and static. Command started calling the mission Whiteout in the after-action reports, and somewhere along the way, the name stopped belonging to the storm and started belonging to me. I never told my father any of this. I never told Delphine. It had never once occurred to either of them to ask. The double doors of the ballroom swung open, and the noise of the party dropped away all at once, the way a held breath drops into silence. Commander Elias Thorne stepped through in his dress blues, every ribbon and qualification badge catching the chandelier light, jump wings, a trident, rows of commendations that told their own quiet story to anyone who knew how to read them. Every donor, every councilman, every socialite in that room rose to their feet without being asked, drawn upright by simple instinct. My father nearly tripped over his own polished shoes, rushing to reach him first. "Elias, my boy," his voice boomed across the parquet, arms already spreading for an embrace the commander hadn't invited. "Welcome, welcome. We are beyond honored to have a man of your caliber joining this family." Delphine swept in behind him, curling her hand around the commander's elbow like a bracelet she intended to be photographed wearing. "We planned this whole evening just for you, darling," she purred, pressing a flute of champagne into his free hand. "Only the very best for my captain." Thorne offered a polite, practiced nod, the kind of expression that had clearly survived 100 galas exactly like this one. But his eyes were already moving, scanning exits, scanning the room's edges, a habit worn into him by years of never fully trusting a room he hadn't cleared himself. His gaze reached the shadowed corner behind the potted palm. He stopped breathing. I watch tea. He confident posture drain out of him in real time, replaced by something closer to shock. The champagne glass slipped from between his fingers and hit the marble floor in a burst of crystal and gold liquid, the sound echoing through a room gone utterly silent. My God, he said, and his voice, though barely above a whisper, carried to every corner of that ballroom. It's the Whiteout pilot. Delphine gasped and stepped backward, tugging her hem away from the spilled champagne as though it might stain her socially as well as literally. My father waved frantically for a server to handle the mess. Elias, don't concern yourself with that, my father said, forcing out a laugh that cracked at the edges. A minor accident, nothing more. Come, let me introduce you to the councilmen at the head table. Thorne didn't even glance at the outstretched hand. He gently disengaged his arm from Delphine's grip and began walking, not strolling, walking, with the unmistakable precision of a man moving with purpose through hostile terrain. The crowd parted around him without needing to be asked. Whispers rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. He crossed the entire length of that ballroom, past the floral centerpieces, past the head table, past the mayor and two city councilmen who half rose from their seats without quite understanding why, and stopped 2 paces in front of the small round table behind the palm. He brought his heels together and snapped a salute so sharp, so absolutely correct, that several retired officers scattered among the guests instinctively straightened in their own seats. Renata, my father's voice cracked across the room, fury chasing away his earlier composure as he hurried over, face reddening. Stand up and greet Commander Thorne properly. What did I tell you about staying out of the way? He turned to Thorne, forcing another brittle smile. Forgive my eldest daughter, Elias. She has no idea how to conduct herself around a man of your accomplishments. Thorne didn't break his stance. Without so much as glancing at my father, his voice rolled out across the hall with the flat, carrying authority of a man used to being obeyed on far worse days than this one. Stand down, sir. 3 words, and the temperature of the entire room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You are addressing Lieutenant Colonel Renata Voss, Senior Aviation Operations Officer for a Special Operations Task Force, and you will show her the respect she has earned in blood. You could have heard a pin drop against the hardwood. My father's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. Delphine stood frozen a few feet back, one hand still hovering near her chest, staring at Thorne as though he had begun speaking a language she'd never learned. Lieutenant Colonel, my father finally managed, looking between the two of us like a man trying to solve an equation with no visible variables. No, Elias, there's clearly some confusion. Renata does administrative work, logistics, she's an office clerk. Thorne lowered his salute slowly, and when he turned to face the room, his expression had gone hard as flint. 5 years ago, he said, his voice pitched to Carrie, my reconnaissance element was ambushed on a ridgeline in conditions rated unsurvivable for aviation. We had a man down, jammed weapons, 70-mile-an-hour winds, and 0 visibility. Every conventional aircraft scheduled for our extraction refused the mission. Command had already begun writing us off. He gestured toward me, without breaking eye contact with the crowd. Then came a call sign. Whiteout. Lieutenant Colonel Voss didn't wait for authorization. She took the stick of a modified Black Hawk herself and flew it blind through mountain terrain, below radar coverage, in a storm that grounded every other aircraft on that base. She held that helicopter in a hover 18 inches off an exposed ledge while hostile fire tore through the fuselage, and she pulled every single one of my men out alive. His jaw tightened. 8 men are alive today, with families and children and entire lives ahead of them, because this woman refused to accept that the mission was impossible. That is who you have spent this entire evening hiding behind a potted plant. A wave of stunned murmurs rolled through the ballroom. Several older men at the surrounding tables, retired officers, a former city commissioner who'd served 2 tours in his own youth, rose slowly to their feet, turning toward my corner with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I could remember. Genuine respect. Delphine's carefully arranged composure cracked wide open. She rushed forward, laughing in that high, brittle way people laugh when they're desperate for a joke to be true. Elias, honey, stop it, you're ruining the whole evening. She grabbed for his arm again. Renata isn't some hero, she's boring, She probably paid someone to make all that up so she could steal my night. Thorn pulled his arm away, as though her touch had scalded him. You think 18 combat citations and 8 men brought home alive is a story someone invents? His voice had gone quiet now, and somehow that was worse than the shouting. I assumed you were simply vain, Delphine. I didn't realize you were this hollow. A woman who can mock her own sister's courage to her face isn't someone I have any interest in building a future with. My father lunged forward, sweat beading along his hairline. Elias, please, let's not be hasty here. We didn't know. If Renata had simply told us what she actually did, we would have given her the place of honor tonight, I promise you. That is precisely the difference between the two of you, Thorn said, his voice ringing clean across the silent room. A real professional doesn't need to announce her accomplishments to demand basic human decency. You didn't disrespect her because she stayed quiet about her career. You disrespected her because you only ever valued people who fed your own vanity. The room's attention had turned entirely away from my father and sister now, guests drifting instinctively toward my corner, applause rising in scattered, uncertain waves, before swelling into something unmistakable. The engagement celebration my father had spent months orchestrating dissolved in front of him, the crowd abandoning the performance he'd staged in favor of the truth that had just walked in wearing a plain charcoal blazer. My father stepped closer, hands trembling, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. Renata, sweetheart, we're so proud of you. Please, come sit at the head table. Let us make this right tonight in front of everyone. I looked at him with a calm I hadn't expected to feel, a stillness that had taken 12 years and several very bad nights to earn. You never wanted a daughter, Richard, I said. You wanted an ornament, and when I didn't shine the way you needed me to, you put me in a corner. I've spent 12 years serving people who value honor and quiet sacrifice over appearances. I don't need your approval. I certainly don't need a seat at this table. I picked up my small clutch bag and walked toward the exit. Thorn fell into step beside me without a word, leaving Delphine standing in the middle of the ballroom floor, mascara beginning to streak, and my father rooted in place like a man who had just watched his own reflection shatter along with that champagne glass. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass and distant rain. Thorn poured 2 glasses of water from a side table on the terrace and handed me one, his stern combat bearing finally softening into something almost boyish. To Whiteout, he said, raising his glass. To getting out alive, I answered, and we both laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that comes after a long mission finally ends. It was an honor serving under that call sign, ma'am, he said. I mean that. Those 8 men still talk about that night like it's scripture. The honor was mine, Captain, I said. Commander, I corrected myself, and he waved it off with a small smile. We stood there a while longer, looking out over the golf course toward the dark tree line, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone's approval to walk into a room. 3 weeks later, I stood in dress uniform at a much smaller, much quieter ceremony. No chandeliers, no ice sculptures, just a base auditorium and a general pinning, a distinguished flying cross to my chest for a mission that had, until that week, existed only in classified files. Thorn sat in the second row beside 6 of the 8 men I'd pulled off that ridgeline, all of them standing when my name was called, the kind of standing ovation that doesn't need chandeliers or string quartets to mean something. My father sent a text message that evening. Saw the article, very proud, sweetheart, call when you can. I looked at it for a long moment, then set the phone face down on the table and went to dinner with people who had never once needed a fern to hide me behind. Some families measure their children in the light they reflect back onto a room full of strangers. Mine had spent 12 years measuring me that way, and I had spent 12 years quietly becoming something no ballroom chandelier could ever properly illuminate anyway. True strength, I've learned, never needs an audience to confirm it's real. And real dignity has never once been something you could rent by the hour along with a ballroom and an ice sculpture.